My name is Katía Truijen. I'm extremely happy to be hosting some of the sessions during this festival. And before I will introduce our next session, I just wanted to bring to your attention the installations that you can visit. Here at the Tolhuistuin, there is the beautiful installation Being a Sentinel Species by Cecil Mariton. There is light scenography by Boris Arquette, which is upstairs. Being a Sentinel Species is downstairs at the wardrobe. And the Anthropocene Monster by Tim van Hooft. And there is more, because you can also take the ferry to the Muziekgebouw aan het IJ, where you find Raumklang every day by Zeno van den Broek and Robin Cook. So don't miss out on that too. We are here for the final session of the second day of the fiber universe, basically, with the very optimistic title, If This Is Our End, What Then? Following from the festival's main theme of mutation, we already spoke yesterday about more than human metabolisms, about xenofutures, and in the following session we will be focusing on a question as vast as how to cope with the idea of human extinction. And for this we will be listening to and thinking with Thomas Moynihan and Alison Sperling. Welcome Alison here in the room, and welcome Thomas remotely from London. I will introduce you two in a bit, and we will reflect upon how to move forward during the sixth extinction. Not so much looking for a fix, of course, but learning from history and science fiction in imagining and coping with our fate as human beings. So as Dr. Rachel Bronson, the CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, said earlier last year, the hands of the doomsday clock remain at 100 seconds to midnight, as close to midnight as ever. And she continues that the lethal and fear-inspiring COVID-19 pandemic serves as a historic wake-up call, a vivid illustration that national governments and international organizations are unprepared to manage the truly civilization-ending threats of nuclear weapons and climate change. The Earth exploded into the nuclear age in July 1945 when the US tested the Trinity bomb in the New Mexico desert, and some also refer to this date as the beginning of the Anthropocene, as on that day we gained both unprecedented influence but also responsibility for our planet. And 76 years on, tens of thousands of tons of plutonium and enriched uranium have been produced, and 40 countries have access to the materials and technology to create nuclear weapons. And meanwhile, the impact of runaway climate change on our planet becomes more tangible every year, and also for the global north, as this was already the case for countries in the global south. And it seems unlikely that we will stay below 2 degrees global warming. As new climate reports confirm, with plummeting biodiversity and receding ice sheets, human life on Earth may be well on its way to extinction. So how do we deal with this fate as human beings? And in what ways will thinking and speculating about our extinction affect us? And in what ways will it cause us to act? Think, for instance, of climate grief, referring to the feeling of loss and anxiety related to the overall effects of climate change. Or doom scrolling, the compulsion to engross oneself in negative news and anticipate existential risks, which became a widespread phenomenon during the pandemic, during lockdowns, and which can be attributed to the negativity bias people have when consuming information. But there is a longer history of humans thinking about human extinction. You could ask whether humans haven't been predicting the end of time since the beginning of history. And as we will learn, I think, from Thomas, there is an interesting distinction here between the idea of the apocalypse as a sense of an ending, where extinction in fact anticipates the ending of sense. The discovery of our extinction could be considered as an intellectual milestone, as no other animal on the planet can assume liability for its own fate in this way. And here it is interesting to look at the role of fiction, and more particularly the universe of science fiction, as we will learn from the work of Alison. Drawing from some of the learnings also from Thomas' book, X-Risk, looking at how we came to care about our faith may also be a call for us to continue to care even more than before when we consider what is ahead of us. So I would like to now introduce you, Thomas, and your work. Thomas Moynihan is a researcher, historian of ideas, and the author of X-Risk, How Humanity Discovered Its Own Extinction. He is currently focusing on the historical significance and importance of contemporary concern for future generations, and he's a research fellow at Forethought Foundation and visiting research associate in history at St. Bennett's College at Oxford University. He has written for and appeared on the BBC, New Scientist, The Guardian, and Aeon. And currently he is working on a book exploring why concern for the far future has emerged only relatively recently when considering the total sweep of human thought throughout the past. Previously, he has written extensively on the history of ideas surrounding human extinction and the development of concepts regarding existential risk. Thomas' talk will address how only in the last handful of generations humans have started to gain scientific insight into where we might be in history's wider arc, of how many generations there are behind us, but also just how many there could be ahead. So with no further delay, I would like to give the floor to you, Thomas.
Thank you, Katía. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I've been looking forward to this. So without further ado, let's get into the talk. So yeah, as you can see, the title of my talk today is From History's End to History's Beginning, How the Future Has Grown Throughout the Past. And yeah, I want to gesture towards the history, as I see it, of how people have discovered just what is at stake in our extinction, but also extinction of other forms of life. So what is lost in extinction, the discovery of that. So yes, to start, I just want to ask this question. Where are we in history? And what does that mean to ask that question? So I would argue that when we talk about where we are in history, we mean not just how much past is behind us, but also how much future could be ahead. Today, I want to look at the history of people's sense of orientation within history. So whether they thought they lived near the beginning or the end of humanity, and how attitudes to this orientation have changed across time. I would argue, beginning in the present, I would argue that there is now a sense of a potentially large future ahead, but one that could be lost now. And I would also argue that this is a strangely novel attitude to time when put into relief against prior attitudes to history and time. So I would argue that most prior generations broadly assumed that they lived nearer the end of time than its beginning, or alternately, that human history couldn't end and would continue in variations on the present, interrupted or not, everlastingly. So either strictly linear or strictly cyclical notions of time. But in contrast to this, now, I feel that we broadly accept that the human future and the future of life more broadly is as capacious as it is precarious. It is contingent. There could be many future generations or none, dependent upon what happens now. And I think that, broadly speaking, when looking at the prior history of ideas, this is quite a novel attitude. So today I want to explore with you some of the story of how we got here. How did we arrive at this novel notion? So to start with, I want to have a look at some of these more cyclical notions of time and history throughout the past. So to go back to the ancients, and I'm going to be talking mainly about the ancients in the Western tradition here. The ancients being the Greeks, the Romans, they didn't realize that species could forever lose the potential to exist. Thus, they didn't realize that species could go extinct in the way that we now recognize what that idea means. They thought that species could be wiped out from some region or even all of Earth. But in the eternities of time, the assumption was that species would return somewhere and some when. This was because there was not yet any acknowledgement that species are historical entities which are historically fragile, dependent for their present existence on uninterrupted chains of backward descent, and reliant for their continued survival on uninterrupted chains of forward succession. There was no acknowledgement that species are thus unique to the Earth and its unique history, such that if they die out here, they die out everywhere forever. Applying these similar notions to ideas of human history, for ancient Greeks like Plato, Aristotle, there was an idea that in the measureless past, everything achievable has already been achieved. And in the measureless future, everything lost will later be returned. Nothing, therefore, can be permanently lost, and nothing can truly be gained. So to just give some demonstrations of this, here's Plato. He talks sometimes of the destruction of the whole of humanity. Here he talks of the periodic destruction at long intervals of the surface of the earth by massive conflagrations, which might lead you to think that he has some notion of human extinction, the idea that the whole of human history could end. However, this is nested within this wider cyclical notion. He says the human race has often been destroyed in various ways, as it will be in the future again too. So when he says these things that sound like extinction events, they're actually not, because they're nested within this wider cycle of returns. So zooming forwards into the Romans, here's the Roman philosopher Lucretius. He expands this notion of the fact that history, if it ends, will just begin again, repeat. He expands this into the wider cosmos by pointing to other planets. So there are parts in his work where he says that the Earth may perish and so may humanity, which again might lead you to say that he's talking about extinction events, but he's actually not, because he elsewhere says here, quote, "In other parts of the universe, there are other worlds inhabited by many different peoples and species." So this type of thinking endured. In fact, it flourished after the Copernican revolution, initiated by the scientific revolution, implied a plurality of worlds throughout physical space. So here's the French writer Bernard Fontenelle from 1686. He says quite explicitly, "So for some ancient stars that disappear, other new ones are born in their places, and that defect in nature must be so repaired, and no species can totally perish." Similar statements from another French writer, Benoit de Malet, from the 1720s. He says, "Whatever may be the fate of this earth and its inhabitants, there are reason to believe that in the great multitude of globes contained in space, there will always be other terrestrial globes beside ours, which are inhabited by as many generations of men and animals." He continues, "When species or civilizations disappear in one globe, they reappear in another. If a sun is extinguished, it is replaced by another. If a globe like ours is set on fire and all its living creatures destroyed, new generations will replace them on another globe." And so he concludes, and is quite explicit, "The endless species of animals shall always exist, will subsist forever, even in the cosmic vicissitudes which seem to destroy them." So again, this idea that history repeats again and again throughout all the globes of space precludes an awareness of species extinction, the fragility of species, of the biosphere itself. This idea that if life dies out here, all the same forms of life will just be re-emerged elsewhere or already be existing elsewhere, which leads people to, particularly in the 1700s, say some rather shocking things about this. Here's Kant from 1750s. He goes as far as saying, "We ought not lament the perishing of a world as a real loss of nature. Let us then regard such terrible catastrophes even with a sort of complacency." This attitude I refer to as cosmic nonchalance, this idea that Earth's destruction, the destruction of biodiversity, doesn't matter, because humanoids and all other species exist and will return everywhere and forever. So we can neither be near history's beginning nor its end, given that it cannot ever end and in a sense has never begun. And just to show how stubborn and persistent this idea is, as late as 1850, the physicist Hans Christian Ørsted was saying the same thing. "The same fundamental idea of the globe and of man must be repeated in each solar system," he said. Now, to look back to this other attitude of time that I pointed to, this quite linear attitude, which is most obviously represented by the monotheistic religions. You may ask, but what of the linear cosmologies of the monotheistic religions? Don't they have a clear end? in some sense, is that not similar to extinction? Yes, but for a start, it was commonly considered much sooner rather than later. And also, it was considered divinely orchestrated, such that there was nothing we could do about it, such that that precludes idea of concern for posterity. So just to put that into relief, here's a picture of a chronicle from the 1400s. And it was written as a world history, including both the past and the future of the history of the world. And the author left some blank pages at the end for the readers themselves to fill in the final periods of world history. The book itself was 300 pages long. How many blank pages did he leave? 6, which gives you a sense of the scale that people presumed back then of the future. They didn't presume there was much of it. Here's Sir Thomas Browne, a devout believer from the 1600s, saying, "'Tis too late to be ambitious. The great mutations of the world are acted, and time may be too short for our designs." So this is a very alien attitude to the future compared to now. And moreover, and more importantly, in religious cosmology, there is no acknowledgement that life, intelligence, ethical agency emerges from and potentially disappears within wider epochal natural history. In religious narratives and cosmologies, ethical agency orchestrates the whole of natural history. It isn't a variable within it. Apocalypse imagines the universe ending how it was designed to. It doesn't acknowledge that it can continue to exist beyond and without all ethical designs. This is what I mean when I say that apocalypse secures a sense of an ending. Extinction anticipates the ending of sense. Within these religious cosmologies, there's no conception of the physical universe meandering aimlessly for epochs devoid of the agencies of life and mind. But then, from the 1600s onwards, geology and the earth sciences started to consolidate, which revealed that life and mind do emerge from and within a wider natural history rather than orchestrating it as a whole. And this was put into relief quite early on by geologists noticing that there are strata that appear to contain no biogenic traces, no signs of life, which implies that the Earth indeed had existed for epochs before the emergence of all life, all observers, all minds. Here's Nicholas Steno from the 1600s saying exactly this. And then moving forwards into the 1700s, naturalists start to theorize that the Earth has a directional history wherein it has a commencement, a duration, and a termination. And the first to really kind of hypothesize this seriously was the French naturalist Georges Buffon in 1770s. He theorized that the Earth began as a molten mass that has cooled over time to become habitable and will continue cooling until it becomes uninhabitable and basically loses all of its internal heat energy. And through this, he put a first quantitative estimate on Earth's future habitability. He said it was around 70,000 years old, and there would be 90,000 years until all living matter becomes a corpse and all organized substance is reduced to raw matter. His methodology and his numbers were wrong, but he was the first to try to put some kind of proportion on how we could expect the future to be, how long we could expect it to be, derived from physical evidence rather than scriptural prophecy. These ideas leaked out into wider culture in the decades following. Here's Henri Saint-Simon from the 1810s, basically being quite explicit about this, that the existence of the human species is linked to that of the planet. It is directly dependent upon it, and geologists agree that the Earth was for a long time uninhabitable for humans as well as for all other terrestrial animals. And at some future time, it will be uninhabitable again, and the human species will die out. So here we see this inversion where people are now acknowledging that life and mind emerges within wider natural history rather than orchestrating the whole of cosmic history. Also, by putting a clear backward stop on past time, This meant that it became much more plausible to suggest that not everything humanly achievable has yet been achieved, here on Earth at least, which was the requisite physical backdrop for emerging theories of social progress. Here's Marquis de Condorcet as early as 1794, being again explicit about this. He says, quote, "The progress of civilization has no other limit than the duration of the globe upon which nature has placed us, and so long as there are no changes within that globe as would no longer permit the human species to persevere." So, given this new scenario, this new attitude to the future, how much time was left? Mid-1800s, thermodynamics emerges. Physicists theorize that the sun produces heat by gravitationally collapsing on itself. They begin making predictions as to how long there is left. The first prediction from William Thomson in 1854 claims that sunlight cannot last as at present for 300,000 years. By the end of the 1800s, physicists begin to converge on very low tens of millions for Earth's habitable future. There's 17 million from Hermann von Helmholtz in 1871, 10 million years from Charles Augustus Young in 1881. This was admittedly larger than Buffon's earlier forecast of 90,000 years, but in the century since Buffon, the sense of life's unexplored potentials had grown, largely due to Darwinism. Moreover, people believed that the ratio of past spent to future ahead was unforgiving. As Robert S. Ball wrote in 1892, quote, "It seems that the sun has already dissipated about 4/5 of the energy with which it may have originally been endowed." What proved depressing was the idea that evolution had come thus far but didn't have the time to go much further. Again, demonstrating this attitude, L.M. Klein wrote in 1893, "All the aeons spent bringing us to the present point, and no sufficient time remains to evolve all the possibilities of our actual state. This is sad indeed, waste, sheer waste on the most gigantic scale." But then, towards the end of the 1800s, radioactivity was discovered, which revolutionized everything. Here's a picture of Marie Curie on the left. She began investigating radioactivity after its accidental discovery by Henri Becquerel in 1896, and along with her husband Pierre, unleashed on the world the theory of radioactivity and the idea that matter is unstable. Almost immediately, people were shocked by the sheer amount of energy on a proportion previously completely unacknowledged that was locked up within radioactive matter. Here's William Crookes in 1903, quite bombastically stating that 1 gram of radium would be enough to blow the British Navy sky high. Quite sensational. And because of this, the press immediately leapt onto this new revolutionary phenomenon of nature. People were just shocked and amazed by the sheer amount of energy locked up in these radio elements. But also what was shocking was also the sheer timescales upon which they appeared to be naturally decaying. In 1906, Robert Strutt made a clock that was powered by a single pinch of radium, and it was calculated to run for many millennia. Not long afterwards, measurements really radically increased, and people realized that some elements were decaying on timescales that extend into the billions of years. But this also provided a new theoretical source of energy and longevity for the sun itself. As early as 1903, scientists started postulating that radium or radioactivity in some sense may be powering the sun. Timescales, past and future, could not help but expand. Here's George Darwin, Charles Darwin's son, saying, quote, "Given the discovery of this new power source, I see no reason for doubting the possibility of augmenting the estimate of solar heat by some such factor as 10 or 20. Another scientist writing a few years later, saying that the discovery of this new form of energy has extended indefinitely the backward and forward sweep of the cosmical timetable. By 1920, the physicist Arthur Eddington was predicting 15 billion years of further sunlight. By 1928, cosmologist James Jeans was forecasting 1 trillion further years. I must note that he got this wrong. It was slashed to 10 billion in the 1940s, and again in the 1960s to 15 billion years of future sunlight. But nonetheless, it gives some sense of how drastically timescales were expanding in these first decades of the 1900s. Communicating this to the public in 1929, Jeans visualized a stamp atop a penny balanced upon a 20-meter high obelisk. The stamp's thickness representing the roughly 5,000 years of recorded history, the stamp and penny combined representing our species' entire existence, and a distance from the stamp down to the obelisk base being the age of the Earth in its entirety. Here's a picture of the obelisk that Jeans was visualizing. It was gifted to Britain by Egypt in the 1800s. But Jeans didn't stop there. He wanted to visualize how much future was ahead if we continued adding stamps that represent 5,000 years of civilization per piece. He wrote, now stick another postage stamp on top of the first to represent the next 5,000 years of civilization, and keep sticking on postage stamps until you have a pile as high as Mont Blanc. Even now, the pile forms an inadequate representation of the length of the future, which, so far as astronomy can see, probably stretches before humanity, unless an accident cuts it short. The first postage stamp represents what humanity has already achieved. The pile which outtops Mont Blanc represents what it may achieve. To give a sense of proportion, here's a painting of Mont Blanc. Jeans concluded that we are creatures of the dawn with unimaginable opportunities for accomplishment and unexplored potentialities ahead. Here's a similar insightful comment from the American geologist Thomas Crowder Chamberlain from 1903. He summed up this inversion of mood from thinking that people lived near the end of time to believing that we could be living nearer its beginning. He wrote, "We have grown up in the belief that the Earth sprung from chaos at the opening of our era and is plunging on to a catastrophe or a final winter in the near future. Quite at variance with this, Earth offers a fair prospect of fitness for habitation for ages yet to come. If this be true, it is eminently fitting that humanity should give a due measure of thought to the ulterior effects of its actions. These considerations especially intensify the problem of those resources on which our civilization so profoundly depends." As a quick aside here, Chamberlain is interesting because he so deeply thought through the ethical conundrums put up by this extended, elongated futurity. He was one of the first to theorize that CO2 emissions might cause global warming, and also one of the first to state that this puts massive responsibility upon the present generation because our actions and emissions may impact those millennia hence. So to wrap this all up and conclude, I want to gesture to this notion, this emerging awareness ever since, that sure, the Earth may remain habitable for far longer than prior generations presumed or could assume, but this is all contingent upon the actions of the present. So these early thinkers of this extended future, these physicists and geologists, they were very sensitized to the fact that, as they say, accidents happen. Jeans stated in 1928, "Accidents may replace our Mont Blanc of postage stamps by a truncated column of only a fraction." And Chamberlain also was sensitive to this. He said, "Earth may be congenial to life for tens of millions of years to come, but congeniality of conditions does not ensure actual realization. The protracted habitability does not necessarily carry the actual realization of the future opportunities thus open to our species," he wrote. Almost immediately as well, radioactivity started making people think that humanity may destroy itself. There were almost immediately fears that tampering with atoms could destroy humanity and the world. But also this discovery of this new power source revealed some perhaps more hopeful prospects. As early as the 1910s, Robert Goddard, the American rocketry pioneer, was asking, will it be possible to travel to the planets around other stars when the sun and Earth have cooled to such an extent that life is no longer possible on Earth? He answered, yes, if it is possible to unlock and control intra-atomic energy. So there was now a vast future ahead for Earth-born life, but it was precarious as it was for luminous. And it's gated now in the post-atomic age upon the actions or misdeeds of the present. And this leads us to ask, however, would intelligences reappear on Earth should humanity squander its chance? Fast forwarding into the Cold War, when humanity had begun emulating the atomic processes going on within stars well enough to actually wipe itself and many other forms of life out, people started asking exactly this question. Here's William W. Howells, the American anthropologist, asking this in 1960. He said, "What about the chances of humans coming into existence again, not elsewhere but on this very planet? Supposing in a moment of idiot progress we really killed ourselves off, would Homo rise again?" He concluded from his knowledge of paleoanthropology and evolution that our hopes for repetition are not good, so we had better stay the hand that drops the bomb. So to conclude, I think we can draw some vague, broad, shaky conclusions from all this. I would argue that regardless of whether you care about humanity, it still has at least an instrumental value as the only technological intelligence in the biosphere. In other words, it is plausible that only humanity can eventually serve as the spark plug for enabling life spread beyond Earth, such that biology can more maximally and fulsomely fulfill its many potentials for development. It would be pre-Copernican to believe that Earth's environments even come close to exhaustively expressing the full affordances for life's variegation and diversification. So I want to close with two final quotes, and I think this might link some of the themes of the talk into the wider topic of mutation. Here's Freeman Dyson, the brilliant physicist. He says, "Life has beautified this planet so enormously. If life could just expand out into the universe, the whole universe would become vastly more diverse and interesting. Why shouldn't we do that? We should be the midwives to make that possible." And to close, a final quote from Olaf Stapledon, the science fiction writer, and he puts this into a more reflective and ethical statement. He says, "What is meant by good is fulfillment in deriving the remote and practical ideals from the needs of organisms of all ranks. Every actual organism which comes into existence claims fulfillment, and its claim must be taken into account in the ideal. But also every organism which might come into existence must be taken into account too. And those must be brought to pass which directly or indirectly will afford the most complete fulfillment of the latent capacities of the active substance which is the cosmos," which is a sentiment that I feel is quite inspiring. And I would like to close there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Thomas, for taking us on this journey of thinking of where we are in history. And I'm extremely intrigued by this notion of cosmic nonchalance and more cyclical ideas of extinction. Maybe we can return to that later. And I would also like to ask the audience here in the room and those who are tuning in remotely to remember and keep your curiosities and questions for the Q&A at the end. And then, thanks again, Thomas. We'll be back after the talk of Alison. Welcome again, Alison. And
thank you. Just getting comfortable on this couch here.
Yeah. Let's move our bodies a bit. I would love to introduce you and your work. Alison Sperling is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Interdisciplinary Women and Gender Studies at the Technical University in Berlin, and affiliate research fellow at the ICI, also in Berlin. And she also teaches theory at St. Joost Ecology Futures program. She works on 20th and 21st century American fiction with a focus on the science fictional in literature and the arts, feminist and queer theory, and the Anthropocene. Her publications include articles, interviews, and reviews in Girlhood Studies, Paradoxa, Rhizomes, Lovecraft Annual, Philosophia, Berlin Artlink, and Los Angeles Review of Books, with forthcoming invited articles appearing in Extrapolation and Science Fiction Studies. She has also published numerous book chapters in edited collections and handbooks, including the Bloomsbury Handbook of 21st Century Feminist Theory, Surreal Entanglements, Essays on the Fiction of Jeff van der Meer, which I hope we will maybe hear more about a bit later, and the first monograph of the Lithuanian video and performance artist Emilia Skarnulite, Sirenomelia. She has recently edited an issue of Paradoxa, Studies in the World Literature on Climate Fictions, and co-edited a special issue of the Journal of the Fantastic in the Arts on weird temporalities. And she's currently at work on her first monograph, Weird Modernism, as well as a second project, it's a lot, on nuclear ecologies and contemporary fiction and art. And your talk, I think, will lay out some key concepts for thinking the relation between contemporary weird and science fictions and ecological thought, while looking at some recent examples of weird fiction and contemporary art. So how to look at weirdness as an approach to how we confront or engage climate change issues and other conditions of the Anthropocene, particularly through theories of queer and feminist speculative ecologies. So with no more delay, Alison, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody, for being here, and for everybody virtually. My very deep gratitude to Fiber for the invitation, and especially I want to thank Zandra, Mark, Jarl, and Rianne, and the other organizers, all of you whom I haven't met yet, but I know there's a lot of kind of labor that goes on behind the scenes here, so thanks for all of your work. The program is just amazing. And it's just great to share the space with you, Tom, and with you, Katía, so thanks for that. Yeah, so my slides are maybe coming? No, I need to do something. That's okay. Welcome back. Oh, it's all good. Thank you so much for coming to the rescue. Okay. Okay, but I still click the same way even though the screen looks different, right? I just still, okay, okie doke. All right, let's see how this goes. So my talk today is in 4 parts, which is also the title, so that's not very exciting, but science fiction, speculation, extinction, mutation. I'm going to talk about a bit about the different modes of SF, including science fictions, of course, but also speculative fiction, climate fictions, and weird fictions in the last section. So we'll start with part 1. Part 1, science fiction, verb. The provocation that the organizers of this session have posed to Tom and to me is really difficult. This big looming question of what are we to do, presumably as individuals and as a supposed species, facing extinction due to anthropogenic climate change. The question is, of course, complex because it's asking a lot at once. How do we cope ourselves and care for others, both psychically, right? Climate change anxiety and depression is very real. And how do we manage and alleviate as best as we can the unpredictable material conditions of becoming extinct? How do we maintain what Donna Haraway calls, in lieu perhaps of something called hope, an ongoingness? How do we learn to die, following Roy Scranton? And what can we still do, and even should we do it? This is all tied up with who the hour is in this provocation, because as we know, especially from Black and Indigenous studies, there have already been many ends of the world. And yes, this is distinct from Earth or planet, but bears acknowledging anyway. It just depends on which world one lived in or lives in. I follow the work of SF scholars who have been for some time pushing the boundaries of what constitutes SF and how it operates, extending it to something beyond a genre and suggesting that science fiction is not only a category for objects or texts, but that it might actually be a philosophy, a practice, a thing one does. Darko Suvin, Cheryl Vint, Stephen Shaviro, Grace Dillon, Jana Brown, Istvan Cisneros Ronay Jr., and many others, as well as the work like that of Walida Imarisha and Adrienne Marie Brown's Octavia Brood, a collection inspired by the work of science fiction author Octavia Butler, and including writing from contemporary social justice movements in the U.S. Marie Brown goes so far as to say that community organizing and activism can themselves be science fictional work. The imaginative work of imagining, for example, a world without war or a world without racism. Science speculative fictions exist, of course, as a genre, but it is also a set of qualities, formal, often in the service of what Darko Suvin called the quality of cognitive estrangement, and it is also a practice to do SF. So this question that the panel posed regarding what might propel humanity writ large to act is already perhaps tied up with doing science fiction. As Walida Imarisha has said in an interview about climate fiction, a subgenre to science fiction, if we limit our imagination, we limit our liberation. There's so many things I'm holding, okay. In a recent essay on climate fiction, Derek Woods writes that it has a unique role as a genre, if it is a genre, which is up for debate, not merely in the cultural imaginary, but actually in the physical world. He writes, quote, "Climate fiction's purpose, whatever its social effects, is ultimately to contribute to the Earth's system's equilibrium. Climate fiction proposes extrapolative realism, but does so in the constitutive and paradoxical presence of a goal that would prevent such future climate from materializing." Is my distance from my mouth to the mic okay? Or okay, good. Woods considers whether a work of literary fiction, to which we can add, I think, artistic fictions, might be imagined as having the supposed purpose to contribute to the Earth system's equilibrium, to a balanced or harmonious state of the lithosphere, land, the hydrosphere, water, the atmosphere, air, and the biosphere life. What does it mean to think of an artwork or a novel in the world as having a material effect on the Earth systems, on the composition of particles in the air or sedimented layers of the planet's geological record? Grace Dillon, in a recent interview, says that climate justice is a big issue that's being addressed in fiction right now. She goes on, "I don't mean that stories are simply talking about climate change, but that the stories themselves become forms of climate justice." Ecological SF and/or climate fictions do seem to have an ecological purpose assigned to them that exceeds other genres. This is evidenced by dozens of essays and articles fixated on what climate fiction can do versus, say, represent in the face of ongoing and impending climate catastrophe. So these are just a few kind of slides of some recent, there's so many of these that you can find and they might seem familiar to you. Will fiction influence how we react to climate change? Climate fiction, can books save the planet? I think both of these are from the New York Times. Oh yeah, you've got that up there. How cli-fi forces us to confront the incipient death of the planet. Woods addresses the dozens of articles like this, but goes on even further to ask whether fictions we create about climate change can affect the world not only in terms of, say, someone reads it and is moved to action, but actually that the way the work itself is the action in somehow a more direct or perhaps less mediated way. In the colonial capitalist ruins of the Anthropocene, to borrow from Anna Singh, SF genres have arguably become more representative of reality than realism can capture. In an essay last year by Jesse S. Cohn, he argues indeed for the ways in which we are increasingly estranged from reality, as pointing to the vast proliferation of SF, horror, and fantasy into the cultural imaginary, what the public sphere is increasingly structured, that the public sphere is increasingly structured itself by SF and the fantastic. What we might call the weirdness of the Anthropocene, to which I'll return later, simply cannot be captured with realism. The seeming reversal of the real and the science fictional is an arguably important moment, and surely it doesn't begin here, wherein reality is actually seen as secondary or following from the fictional. The feelings that the real is becoming itself representational is fairly in line with recent genre scholarship, especially of horror and SF, that these genres better represent the real than realism itself. The horrors of ecological catastrophe, which include countless other related horrors like racial capitalism, for example, require speculative modes to try and make sense of such a world, or at least find a way to carry on within it. Part 2, speculation. Born in South Korea and living in New York, Annika Yee's new piece, In Love with the World, now on view at the Tate Modern in London, is an installment of AI beings called aerobes, floating and bobbing in Turbine Hall, a post-industrial space that used to be part of the Bankside Power Station. In addition to helium-filled balloons and highly technological apparatuses like small fans and robotic tentacled legs, the aerobes constitute a speculative aquatic ecosystem swimming in midair. As an artist who usually works with scent, Yee recreates particular moments from London's past which change weekly, reanimating, say, the Industrial Revolution by how it smelled, a kind of what we might call atmospheric history. It's a work about the future, the past and the present simultaneously, and challenges neat temporal distinctions about what constitutes an ecological system, its time, and its place. In a recent talk on a work in progress, SF scholar Steve Shaviro said that all SF is about futurity. And I see that maybe there might be some overlaps with Tom's presentation here. And this is just really new. I just saw this talk last week. So yeah, bear with me as I try to, and I hope I don't botch it. And I don't know if Steve's here online, but if he is, I hope I do your work justice. Distinct from the future, SF is always about potentialities and not actualities. It's about something in a future that could happen but never does, something that is always unrealized, an opening to risk and uncertainty, a perpetual not yet, something vague, always plural. Speculative fictions are not predictive, even though sometimes we feel like they are retrospectively, but rather are about things that will not be or were not, but could be or could have been. Speculation in this context is to craft a narrative that is one of many, futurity and not the future. It's about imaginative capacities, and it's also always about the present. Futurity is therefore not a point on the timeline. It's a set of possibilities that have not yet unfolded. We might think of it as a testing of possible hypotheses, of imagining a better future as a way to impact the present. Futurity is not about eventness, but instead a haunting of the present. So dread of impending planetary doom, for example, but can also inspire the present, imagining a world without racism. Perhaps Adrienne Marie Brown's comment that social justice work is science fiction work is closer to the speculative fictional than the science fictional. But regardless, and to borrow again from Haraway, it matters what stories we tell stories with, it matters what thoughts think thoughts. Claire Colebrook, feminist philosopher, drawing no doubt on Haraway's concept of situatedness, adds that it matters how we perceive perspectives, that multiple partial perspectives intensify objectivity. Stretching across the room where it is installed, the large-scale video installation of Lithuanian artist Emilia Skarnalytė reflects in black liquid ceiling installed above. The artist works at the murky boundaries between documentary and fiction, focusing on the concept of deep time in the sciences and expressed as a post-human mythology. This work, T1/2, the symbol for half-life, is commonly used in nuclear physics to describe the rate at which unstable atoms undergo radioactive decay. The work was shot in part at the decommissioned Ignalina nuclear power plant in Lithuania and in nuclear submarine channels in the Arctic Circle. Footage also includes remote sensing 3D scans of Japan's Super Kamiokanda, a neutrino observatory located deep under Mount Akano in Hida, Japan, designed to detect high-energy neutrinos to look out for supernova in the Milky Way, as well as CERN's high-energy physics accelerator. Staging the eerie impossibility of experiencing a world without us, Skarnalytė describes the work as being from the perspective of a future alien archaeologist amidst the future ruins of humankind, the ruins of highly sophisticated technologies, their promise and their failure, their catastrophes, what remains. T1/2 stages an immersive conflict of temporal scales, as well as the tensions between the sciences and the mythical. Performing in the work as a siren from the distant past or future, we were all fish once, as Timothy Morton has said of this work. Her work continually suggests that science is also softness. It is felt in the towers of seaweed swaying in the current, or in her glimmering, scaly tail as it undulates through submarine channels abandoned since the Cold War. The siren reoccupying historically militarized space deeply entrenched in the history of nuclear science. Played out are the pluralities of futurity, an attempt to think humanity after or out of the future. Scarnelite's aestheticizing and perhaps monumentalizing of techno-scientific facilities is yoked to the seductive feminine power of the siren, a pastness and a futurity of the present. Part 3, extinction. Is extinction thinkable? Can we think after extinction, as Scarnelite attempts to do in her work? What are the limits of speculative fiction and thought? Philosopher Eugene Thacker has argued that extinction serves as the absolute limit of thought. As a philosophical problematic, extinction can neither be experienced nor adequately thought. He writes, "Who is the witness of extinction? In the case of the extinction of all human beings, who is it that gives testimony to this extinction, to the very thought of extinction? In this sense, human extinction can never be fully comprehended, since its very possibility presupposes the absolute negation of all thought, insofar as thought is understood to be the privileged way in which we as humans account for ourselves and make meaning of the world." Thacker's provocation has resonated with me for some time, this paradox of trying to think one's own end or a communal end. And yet, a growing body of work on questioning the terms of extinction present a new series of questions and problems. Audra Mitchell has pointed out, for example, that going extinct is not equivalent to disappearing, that it involves a range of processes that produce, transform, and deform a diverse group of subjects. She writes, quote, "The concept," oh, no, not a quote, this is my words, quoting myself. She writes, "The concept of species is neither natural," no, I write, "The concept of species is neither natural nor neutral. It has been forged through centuries of Western-centric philosophical and scientific debate. While these concepts help to enable scientific and public debates about extinction, they reify life in a number of ways. As arguably abstract concepts, Mitchell points to the restrictions imposed by the biological species concept and its emphasis on sexual reproduction. She writes, quote, "This concept ingrains a fundamentally heteronormative and gendered notion of life and evolution that predicates the existence and therefore the value of species on the basis of biparental sexual reproduction requiring male and female species. Yet, as we know, reproduction entails a diverse set of processes which should not be evaluated against the standards of heterosexuality." So the point here is, of course, not that communities of organisms, what we call species, don't end, or that we shouldn't care or worry about what we call extinction. It's rather that species and extinction as a concept founded on the category of that extinction as a concept founded on the category of species deserves further thought. It's true, for example, that the last Tasmanian tiger was seen almost a century ago. It's true that shark populations have declined 70% in the last 50 years due to overfishing. It's true that biodiversity on the planet, yet another term Mitchell challenges, is at risk of being cut in half by the end of this century. But again, it's important what concepts we use to think these events. Because it's also true, and this may be obvious to other people but has only recently become so to me, that extinction is also a concept. For instance, many parasitic or so-called invasive species on the brink of extinction are not even listed on the red list of endangered species. So even this small fact might demonstrate how extinction is a form of biopolitical management and control based on questions of what species are worth conservation, what species are able to garner the care to be protected, and often by the very species that have threatened their existence in the first place. I want to show two artists' works on extinction. Not human extinction, but animal extinction, a term which I'll continue to use with the acknowledgement that it's possibly insufficient. The first is one that I'm a bit more critical of for my purposes today, but I still like and is worth looking at. And the second is an approach to thinking extinction in what I read as a more abundantly queer and critical mode. This is a work by Janet Lawrence, an Australian artist and activist, called Deep Breathing: Resuscitation for the Reef, which is an undersea hospital for coral ecosystems. There are fish and marine life specimens and dead coral in jars of formaldehyde, and the coral are linked together with a red string as if to signal a kind of blood transfusion. These are pieces that are more about endangerment and about care. How do we care for non-human others? In a way, this is, however, pretty normative in its conception of what ecological care can be. You know, it relies on this kind of band-aids and blood transfusions, reliant on Western medicine as the fix, or the thing that signals care as opposed to possibly other more radical acts. The aesthetics of care here are meant to infuse hope or possibility of restoration for a damaged planet and threatened biodiversity. The second work is by Sally Ann McIntyre, and I want to thank Adriana Knuff, who presented yesterday, who she introduced me to her work fairly recently, who is a New Zealand artist working primarily with radio and sound. She works often with birds and bird recordings, especially of extinct birds, radio as landscape and ecosystem. This work, collected Huya notations like shells on the shore when the sea of living memory has receded from 2015, is a work for phonograph, solo piano, and extinct bird. It collates the 4 known Western musical notations of the Song of the Huya, an endemic New Zealand wattle bird which was driven to extinction in the last decades of the 19th century, partially through the attention of overzealous, wealthy Victorian ornithologists and museum collectors. In developing collected Huya notations, the notations were first played on piano and then cut to phonographic wax cylinder. Invented in 1877, this was the only commercially available sound recording technology available while the Huya was alive. They are played back in the gallery on an Edison Gem phonograph, the smallest and least expensive machine Edison produced, introduced in February 1899, intended for domestic use. The sounds, as you'll see, I'm going to play a quick clip, are further degraded and rendered intangible through the successive stages of this translation process, only serving to emphasize their distance, lack of accuracy, in which empirical term renders them dubious scientific records. You're nervous, but I remember how to do this. You showed me, I got it. Control, 0. Oh, now what? Yeah. All right. I was so confident. That's okay. It's good to take a minute anyway. Yeah, the recording isn't even so amazing that maybe it's worth too much trouble, but okay. It might be nice just to hear the sound. Thank you so much. Stop it there just in the interest of time. Which I just noticed is close. Great. Radio is haunted by extinction and absence reanimated, though importantly, only through distortion and layers of overt mediation rather than at an attempt at scientific accuracy or truthful representation. There is no accurate way in which one can record nature or record the world. There is no objective view or representation of history that can be captured. Distortion, then, and looking ahead to mutation, is a way of thinking about loss and mourning for that which came before us that we can never know, just as it suggests the limited ways in which we could have known the bird even while it was alive. Interestingly, the bird was declared extinct in 1907, but there were credible sightings as late as 1960s. So even the concept of extinction here is, of course, based on human documentation of it. And there's countless examples of these kinds of species becoming unextinct, and this is a kind of interesting question. I think it's something worth exploring. Like, what are the conditions of which something becomes unextinct? And someone in the Sound Ecologies lab this morning that I was visiting, she said that they're called Lazarus species, which I think is kind of interesting because they rise again from the dead. All right, so we're on my last section now. Part 4, mutation. In 2021, Thomas L. Friedman announced in the New York Times that global weirding was here. Offering the weird as an alternative to the warm of global warming, Friedman proclaimed that global warming simply does not convey the supposed global experience as if there was only one of climate change. The weirdness of contemporary climate, its unprecedentedness, at least in the history of documented humanity, its weird weather, increasingly massive and hugely destructive storms, fires, earthquakes caused by fracking, acidification of the oceans, etc., we've heard this list before, is not just about warming, it's about the weird. Unpredictability and living under the dread of wondering what will happen next and knowing it isn't going to be good. Weirdness contains one of the primary paradoxes and conflicts of the Anthropocene as a term. There's an impending sense of human insignificance. Temporally, as a species, we are a mere blip on a vast timeline of the universe, and yet have caused destruction and devastation in such a blip of time more than any other species on the history of the planet ever. The weird as a genre, mode, or aesthetic has a number of relevant qualities to describe or engage our current climatological moment. It points to things inexplicable. Weird is often the placeholder for lapses or gaps in linguistic capabilities. It asks what worlds are made and what worlds are broken when the assumptions about our epistemological foundations are pulled out from under our feet. The so-called laws of nature do not exist as such. The world is unknowable and perverse. As Jeff and Ann Vandermeer's description of the new weird as a category, that revises the horrible racial and gender politics of the old weird associated with writer H.P. Lovecraft. The weird is also a mutation or a transformation, often of the human into something less human. More plant, more fungi, rock, more bacteria, sometimes alien, sometimes into something totally uncharacterizable at all. Unlike old weird of Lovecraft, these new weird texts are, to varying degrees, astounded by and embracing otherness. Characters often learn to transform or perish to realize that our bodies have never been human. And I want to close by presenting two final pieces, actually this time of literature, of what I think of as weird fictions. Rita Indiana is a queer writer, artist, and musician from the Dominican Republic whose novel Tentacle is translated from Spanish in 2018. It was originally written in 2015. Set in the Caribbean sometime between 2027 and 2037, though reaches back to other moments as far as 1606, when buccaneers first landed on the shores of Hispaniola, Tentacle follows 3 successive ecological disasters, including a biological weapons spill now spreading to the Atlantic. Surrounded by a sea of dark, lifeless sludge, epidemics, and acid rain, Tentacle is a gender-bending and time-traveling trip, including African deities and black magic, movement through a toxic, hyper-capitalist world of sexual violence, slimy art dealers, brutish sex, and a racism that still prevails. Primarily, it is about Isilda, who transitions midway through the novel, a process involving a sea anemone, which enables Isilda to travel back in time to formulate a plan to save the oceans for a woman he comes to love in another time. And this is just an excerpt of this moment of Isilda's transition in the novella. Before beginning, Eric took a quick look at the jar where the sea anemone rested. It was in bad shape, like him, and he'd have to act fast. As soon as the rainbow bright entered her bloodstream, Isilda began to convulse. I've killed her, thought Eric. They sold me rat poison. But soon she stabilized, and he checked her vital signs at intervals. At midnight, her small breasts began to fill with smoky bubbles as her mammary glands consumed themselves, leaving a wrinkled web that looked like gum around her nipple, which Eric removed with pinchers so it wouldn't get infected. Underneath grew a masculine skin. Her cells reconfigured themselves like worker bees. It was daybreak when the body, confronted with the total annihilation of the female reproductive system, convulsed again. With contractions that made her lower abdomen rise and fall, she expelled what had been her uterus. At noon the next day, Isilda Figueroa was wholly a man. Tentacle is a novel that imagines a trans body that is not only transgender but transspecies and transtemporal, and very much needed for any ecological future. In a way echoing movements like Afrofuturism and Indigenous futurism, this could be called a speculative trans-futurist text that shows a futurity not only where trans people have survived, but are actually crucial to the survival of everyone else. It's not a utopia, it's kind of grim, but a story about a person whose process of transitioning is the very process that enables him to go back in time and save the oceans. So that gender fluidity and a form of liberation is imagined as a kind of precondition for the well-being of ecological futures and pasts. This corporeal flexibility appears to be a key to survival, as Samuel Ginsberg writes of the novella. Gender and racial justice are not separable from ecological concerns, but imperatives intertwined and inseparable. I'm on my last slide now, yeah? Okay. I conclude with a text very much associated with weird fiction, Annihilation, as I always do. The novel from 2014 by Jeff Vandermeer as the first book in the Southern Reach trilogy, and a few stills here from the 2018 adaptation of the same name directed by Alex Garland. Annihilation is the story of the 12th expedition of 4 women into a zone called Area X, a highly toxic alien terrain modeled after the swampy lowlands of Florida, a landscape so weird that its exploration renders normal scientific tools for thought and study obsolete. Area X is, in the narrator, the biologist's words, a pristine wilderness devoid of human life, where our instruments are useless, our methodology broken, our motivations selfish. Dolphins with human eyes, vines growing in readable phrases upon a wall. This is a place where those who enter it encounter multiple versions of themselves, explorers whose sense of self is annihilated and explodes into a multiplicity never fully explained. Some readers of the book have likened Area X to a kind of nuclear toxic zone of alienation, as a place that alters the body at the cellular level. Indeed, the novel and subsequent film adaptation imagine the contaminated body as multiple and plural, doubling and redoubling, mutating until there is no real original version of the self, but only endless copies. It is both a toxic, cancerous multiplicity, and at the same time, it constitutes a kind of liberation from the bounded, individualized, and embodied self. Vandermeer's trilogy neither condemns nor glorifies toxic or mutated nature, and does not attempt to recuperate the myth of a natural purity. There is no untouched wilderness in the Anthropocene, and there is nothing to return to. It's a series I keep returning to, even after I think I've said pretty much enough about it by now. Last week, I picked up Jana Brown's 2021 book, Black Utopias, realizing I had never finished it. And as I opened to the conclusion, I found that her last example, it's just a single page, was also about annihilation, but this one about the film. And I was kind of shocked by this, actually. And so maybe it's more accurate that I'm concluding not with Vandermeer, but with Jana Brown's reading, with the hopes that it can tie some of these many threads together. Annihilation also troubles the concept of extinction through destabilizing the concept of species and scientific categories that have largely served white and often violently oppressive agendas. In the film, the flora and fauna reproduce and create seemingly impossible crossbreeds of flowers. An alligator has shark teeth. The women start to transform inside Area X with varying responses to their transformation. Brown recounts the scene on the last page of her book from the perspective of Josie, played by Tessa Thompson, a black woman in the expedition group. Josie says, "You want to fight it," speaking to Lena, who's played by Natalie Portman. She wants to fight it, referring to the group's leader. I don't think I want any of those things. For Brown, the choice not to hold on to her humanness, or of speciation, distinctions, and thus of ontological hierarchies, anthropocentrism, biology, and the like that undergirds it, is a refusal of a black woman to be bound any longer by the oppressive white constraints of these categories. Stuck in Area X, Josie begins to sprout saplings from her arms, slowly transforming into a flowering bush. Wonder where the end of my talk is. It's here somewhere, we'll find it. Suspense. Got it. Brown, these are Brown's words, quote, "Josie chooses another form of relation, not one associated with human dominance over the environment, nor with its classification into a dominant system of knowledge, but of radical dissolution. Her choice is not a complete disappearance, but a dismantling, a relinquishment of the idea of gene ownership. All means of species classification are no longer relevant. Josie rejects the history of the category of the human in favor of what Brown might describe as a speculation that exists beyond life or death, a black speculative vision that claims space and creates through what Brown describes as reaching into the unknowable. This may not be exactly a utopia for Brown or for Josie, but crucially, it is also not a death. In the Anthropocene, we need more critical ways to think about the so-called end, not as something that happens once, and finally, to the fiction of humanity with a capital H, but something that happens again and again, and out of which still comes creativity, liveliness, and joy, but on radically different and unpredictable terms. Thanks.
Wow. Thank you so much, Alison.
Thank you.
And Thomas also for your beautiful, rich and abundant stories, and which are, I think, both your stories in itself are vast networks of knowledges and imaginaries. And thank you also for challenging this contemporary, our contemporary thinking about extinction. And yeah, also, Alison, as you were saying, to really connect it to the political questions of what are the bodies and species that are worth to be preserved. And I think what is really fascinating in regards to both your talks is, your interest and investment in the kind of imaginative stories that we tell ourselves, and our curiosity for the future that we may or may not have. Whether it's trying to interpret the world around us or by imagining other worlds and relations. But then also to look at like forms of storytelling, like how they can be understood as strategies for survival. Your notion of futurity as like haunting of the present. I think it's also beautiful, Alison, how you ended also with this cyclical idea, which kind of refers also to the end of your talk, Thomas, and then your build up, Alison, of science fiction, speculation, extinction, and mutation as a kind of almost strategy for survival as well. I don't know, Thomas or Alison, who wants to go first?
Do you want to go? You can see us. Do you want to go first, or do you want me to? Do you have something you want to go with right away, Tom?
You go ahead, Alison.
Okay. Thanks for that question and point about, like, and this we talked a little bit about yesterday, right? This the question of stories for survival, and I mean I don't have a big point to say other than what I just said, which was like a 30-minute point, but I think I would point to some of the work being done in Indigenous studies on survivance as a different way to think about something like survival, which is also, interestingly, this boundary between it exists between neither life nor death. It's a kind of formation of flourishing, and of course this comes out of Indigenous studies because Indigenous cosmologies are so much about storytelling and the carrying on of particular stories. And Grace Dillon talks about the fact that actually science fiction, or in Indigenous stories, science is also a story, right? So science is storied, and so I think there's a lot of connections to be made there. Maybe more towards questions of something like survivance versus survival, which feels, maybe not worth doing. I'm not sure. Whereas survivance does, I guess, in a different way.
Yeah. Let's keep that in mind. And Thomas.
I just want to say first, I'm getting quite a bad echo. Is that?
You sound fine here.
Okay, fine. I'll just try and ignore my Actually, you know what? I'll turn my sound off. So okay, right. I just wanted to say thank you so much, Alison, for amazing talk. Plenty of insights in there that I should take on board, and loads of places that I'm going to have to go, particularly this the Beyond Biodiversity and Species paper. I'm immediately going to leave this and go and read that. It just seems like a really fascinating approach to the idea. Thank you. But to Katya's question on narratives as strategies for survival. I guess in my talk I was very much running through a whole bunch of scientists, but I spend almost half of my time reading and going through science fiction as well. And again, in Alison's talk, I was really interested by the slide with Chivero's ideas. I'm gonna have to go and find that. I'm familiar with his work, but haven't checked in on him for a while, so I'll have to go and check up on that. But yeah, I mean, a lot of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about these, key, concrete, tangible issues for the world right now involve necessarily counterfactuals. So just talking of extinction, it is a counterfactual type of talk because, we're talking about it. Otherwise people wouldn't be around. And so just from the history of these ideas as well, most of these ideas appear first in fiction and then spill out. So, the first, as far as I'm aware, the first novel in the English language that depicts the extinction of humanity, and more importantly, this makes clear that the rest of the biosphere, the rest of the Earth, continues beyond after humanity, is Mary Shelley's Last Man from the early 1800s. So it was kind of first in fiction that these ideas were explored, and that continues through into science fiction. So I think that's a really nice way of thinking about it, as fiction as providing strategies for survival. And at least in my work, it's the science fiction authors and the fiction authors that often get there first. So I think it's a great way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and maybe to come back, Thomas, to your distinction between what we have maybe understood before in this more linear notion of like apocalypse as the end of, or as the sense of an ending, where extinction is maybe the end of sense. And I was thinking how your notions of science fiction and weirdness, Alison, relate to those different views. Or
Tom, do you want to just rehash those views for me so then I can respond to that? This difference between apocalypse and extinction, because I don't know if we talked. Did you talk about it? I think I missed it. If you did, you didn't, right? You didn't really talk so much about the difference, or maybe a little bit.
I mentioned it very briefly.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's this, because it's hard to put a huge, big idea into a sentence, and there will be trade-offs when you do that. But that's my attempt to kind of sum up my work and book in one sentence. So whether or not it works is a different question. But it's this idea that in my work very thus far very much focuses on Western history, which is a thing that I'm hoping to rectify going forwards. But very much in the West, the apocalyptic attitudes in Christian, Islamic, Judaic, the Abrahamic monotheistic West, it's very much this idea that the apocalypse is almost the culmination of meaning and morality within the universe, is kind of, the crescendo and the absolute conclusion of it, rather than its termination within this physical universe that continues without us. And so that's the way I see this new idea of extinction. And the important thing is this idea that, and it doesn't just have to be, a kind of anthropocentric way of thinking about things. I think it applies to life more broadly, is that life is a unique type of agency within the otherwise inorganic physical cosmos. It tends to push that physical inorganic cosmos into more interesting and more improbable states, complexity, right? So I think I personally just think there's an inherent value in that, and so therefore life should be preserved and conserved in its exuberance and its diversity. So this idea that I just think that, this recognition that the inorganic, inactive, abiotic cosmos could continue without these agencies is a radically troubling, alienating, and also, I would argue, more right. But I think it connects with your work, because it's almost the culmination of this alienating trajectory of scientific thought. It's almost the combination of the weird, the idea that, as you point out with that brilliant Thacker quote, is that the thought of extinction is the idea that reality is, just absolutely alien from us. We have to kind of, and again, this links into the counterfactual thing, we have to abrade all of the qualities that we're familiar with from reality, and we are left with this kind of kernel of unknowability, which, so I think that's this inherent connection between the extinction and the weird. I know I've drifted far from apocalypse and sentiment, but nonetheless, there you go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's no coincidence that Thacker in that book and in others is reaching back to Lovecraft and to the kind of this cosmic pessimism of this kind of Lovecraftian world that doesn't care about us, right? That's emphasizing the kind of human insignificance on a grand scale. I mean, as far as the weird and questions of extinction. I haven't thought about them explicitly together until today for this talk, which I just wrote this week. So it still feels kind of fresh. Like a lot of it just feels like I just threw out a bunch of ideas that I'm just not so, they're just underdeveloped so far. But I mean, I guess one of the things that I was trying to develop is that it's unclear in these kind of weird ecologies, some of which seem sometimes apocalyptic or dystopian, but often not, is that it's not quite clear what's ended and what's beginning, right? You're not quite sure, which is also, I think, very much a question of speciation still in the sciences, right? This is actually quite still up for debate. When a species becomes a new species or when a species becomes extinct is always still quite difficult to determine. And so I find that there's a kind of interesting thing happening in these weird ecologies, right? And of course it's always about mutation, but I loved this Brown reading because I couldn't quite figure out what I was trying to say until I kind of just stumbled upon it this week, right? That what if we're not thinking in terms of the end? And of course there are dangers to this, right? Some things do end and we have to recognize this, but it's not always the case, right? And also as the Mitchell paper talks about, is that extinction is also sometimes an end, but also sometimes something new, and so that's also important to remember as far as extinction as a process goes.
Yeah. And then, what you mentioned, the idea of the unextinct species, or also the cyclical idea again of extinction, is super interesting. I was wondering if there is a question from the audience. Yes. Shall I come to you?
Maybe it also relates to this, but it's in particular for Thomas, I think you're called. So suppose everything goes well and humanity, or what we call humanity, continues for 1 billion years. I don't know so much about evolution, but I guess it would be a significantly different kind of entity that exists in such a time. And if you say, okay, but it's still humanity because of a causal chain relating to us, don't you then get? But I don't know the mathematics of this precisely. But then, if it's just about consciousness or something like that, don't you get something like cyclical history, because there's so many universes, so there must be consciousness on in some other places also, and then maybe it doesn't matter so much after all because one of those will survive. But
Thank you. I can't see the audience, so it's kind of again alienating. But thank you. That's a fantastic question. So on the first point, say if in one of these, grand futures that may happen where humanity persists, and I stress, perhaps these are improbable, but say humanity persists for that long. Again, I don't. I'm not a kind of the evolutionary scientist, obviously, so I wouldn't be able to answer the actual kind of factual aspect of that question. There's an interesting book written recently, I failed to remember the author, it was published by MIT, on actually how, things might go in this real long run. Unfortunately, I can't remember the title. Anyway, but what I refer to as humanity is not so much like and obviously this is a question that, as I think Alison pointed out in her talk, we should problematize and question humanity with the capital H, definitely. But what I mean is not necessarily a causal chain or some kind of causal forward effect, so much as just the project, the shared project, the collective project, and hopefully, obviously, that's a difficult question as well, but the shared project of bettering ourselves and bettering the world that we're in. So I don't necessarily mean a progressive project in the sense where, that Marquis de Condorcet quote that I showed, but more in the sense of the ability to just correct ourselves and the ability to correct the past and the errors of the past and etc. That going forwards, obviously that has to link into some causal forward effect, but I mean that rather than just some blunt gene ownership kind of idea, right? I think I want to think of humanity just in a really capacious way. So I'm kind of using it as a placeholder for just good things happening, whether that's hopeful and naive, I don't know. But just to very quickly answer the second part of your question, these things are all open to revision, as all scientific ideas are, regarding, there are many ways in which cyclical history could still apply. There's still models of oscillating universes. There's models, ideas, theories of multiverses. There's still the idea that after the heat death, there will still be things going on for such a long time that there is potential over vast, like 10 to the hundreds timescales, where there'll be thermodynamic fluxions and things will just pop into existence. There are all these ideas where cyclical history could still apply, but across history, the kind of horizon within which that cycle can apply has just expanded outwards and outwards. So for Plato and Aristotle, as I gestured, it was kind of the horizon wherein genuine history happens, and then outside of it you get these cycles and eternal returns, was kind of their idea of their polis, and then it expanded with geology to include the whole planet. Now the planet is deeply historical, but we can point to other planets and say, oh, history will repeat elsewhere, and then that's expanded out into the kind of wider galactic region, when people realized that other planets were probably unpopulated for the most part. And then in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, with the emergence, consolidation of Big Bang Theory, now we kind of acknowledge that the whole universe, observable universe itself, exhibits a deep, meaningful history, such that we now have to point beyond the observable universe towards cycles and eternal returns. So all I would say is that there's a direction of travel here where the lesson of this history is that irreversible consequence and impact and the ulterior effect of our actions may apply within just a very, 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 very big arena of spatio-temporal zone, right? So there could be cycles elsewhere, but we now know that our impact of our actions, negative or positive, applies in potentially a huge arena. And for me, that's, means that we should really seriously think and be responsible and stop doing the bad things that we're doing. So, sorry, that was a long answer.
Do we have time for me to ask Thomas something, or just a quick comment? I know we're sort of right at time, but I was just, it's sort of a simple, you're not there, you're here. There's sort of a simple kind of question that you, the way you talked about the future, and I'm thinking of it just because I'm also just kind of swirling with the ideas of Steve's recent talk about futurity versus the future. But you were talking about like how the future is so quantifiable in a way, like how long will the future be? How much future is ahead? Will you just say like a little bit more about that, like what you mean by that?
Thank you. Yeah, that's a really good question. So what I think is important is this idea of how much, the quantitative estimate. It's not how much in the sense of actuality or the future. It's in that wider, expanded sense of a possibility space. So people aren't saying, oh, the future of humanity or life is now 4 billion years or whatever. Recent estimates put kind of complex life on Earth as something under 1 billion because of the expanding luminosity of the sun. So it's not like a hard prediction that this is going to happen in our timeline. It's saying that here's an upper bound, a boundary condition on the possibility space within which all evolutionary theories will play out. Our actual one is just a trajectory in that space, or will be, right? But it's this idea of the conditions of possibility, the space of possibility. So I think that's what, you've kind of made me kind of articulate why I found that Shaviro slide so resonant, is I think it's that exact same thing. So I don't think we're talking about hard predictions here. We're just talking about this space of possibility, which it's our duty to allow future generations to exist such that they can explore it in the most fulsome way possible, and we shouldn't be closing off options within that space for them. Yeah, thank you. That's a fantastic
that's great.
question.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I think that's a beautiful way to end, which is, I don't think it's possible. It's funny, we're talking about end and endings, but I feel that we should go on for hours. And I hope that you will also, maybe we can share like a bibliography of like all the beautiful stories that you shared with us as well.
Sure.
And of course all the links that you made. And maybe just to wrap up with some of the things I noted down. I think it was Thomas Brown who said it's too late to be ambitious, but luckily we have science fiction as a verb, which is about potentiality rather than actuality. So we are the only entity we know of that has a history atoning for the errors in the past, and maybe science fiction and weirdness as an approach can help us to imagine and enact other possible futurity. And I also remember, Alison, what you were saying, if we limit our imagination, we also limit our liberation. So thank you so much, Alison and Thomas and everyone here in the room.
Thanks, Tom.
Thank you,
Thank
Tom.
you. Thank you,
Alison.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone of the Fiber team, the technical team, those human beings that are tuning in from home, and all of you here to listen and think with us. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much.
And we will be back here on the stage tomorrow again for the 5th session at 1:30 with another amazing title, which is There is No Such Thing as Nature, with artist, designer and educator Leanne Wijnsma and interaction designer Monica Seyfried from Grow Your Own Cloud. And also for those who are tuning in remotely, there will be again the mutation stream with experimental films and video art. Thank you again and see you tomorrow.
Oh